What if I told you that the greatest king in biblical history had a secret that could shake the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about King David? A secret so scandalous that it's been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years, buried beneath layers of religious tradition and carefully crafted narratives. Today, we're about to uncover the shocking truth about the hidden waves of King David. And trust me, what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the man after God's own heart. You see, when most people think of King David, they picture the young shepherd boy who slayed Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone. They think of the Psalms, the dancing before the ark, the man who united Israel into a mighty kingdom. But what they don't talk about in Sunday school, what gets glossed over in children's Bible stories, is the dark and complex web of relationships that define David's personal life. We're talking about multiple wives, countless concubines, political marriages that were nothing more than strategic power plays, and relationships that would make today's tabloid headlines look tame by comparison. But here's what's truly shocking. The Bible doesn't hide these details. They're all there, recorded in stark detail for anyone willing to look deeper. Yet somehow these stories have been sanitized, romanticized, or simply ignored by generations of believers who couldn't reconcile the image of the godly king with the reality of his complicated personal life. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and examine the untold stories of the women who shared David's bed, bore his children, and paid the ultimate price for his political ambitions. Are you ready to have your understanding of biblical history completely transformed? If so, drop a Y in the comments below, because what we're about to explore together will challenge everything you've been taught about one of the Bible's most celebrated figures. And make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this is just the beginning of a journey that will take us deep into the hidden scandals of biblical royalty. Now, before we dive into the shocking details, I want to set the stage for you. We're not just talking about one or two questionable relationships here. According to biblical records and historical analysis, King David had at least 8 named wives, though scholars believe the actual number could have been as high as 18 wives, plus 10 concubines whose stories are specifically mentioned in Scripture, and potentially dozens more whose names have been lost to history. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a man who had more romantic entanglements than some modern celebrities, yet he's held up as the standard of godliness in the Old Testament. How is that possible? What were the circumstances that led to such a complex web of relationships? And more importantly, what happened to these women? What were their stories, their struggles, their triumphs and tragedies? Here's where it gets even more intriguing. Each of these relationships tells a different story about power, politics, love, betrayal, and survival in ancient Israel. Some of these women were princesses, daughters of kings who were used as political pawns to secure alliances. Others were widows who found themselves caught in the crossfire of royal ambition. Still others were victims of circumstances far beyond their control. Women whose lives were forever changed by their association with the most powerful man in the kingdom. But perhaps the most shocking revelation of all is this: many of these relationships directly violated God's own commandments for how a king should conduct himself. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, God explicitly warned that the future king of Israel should not multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Yet David did exactly what God had forbidden, and the consequences of his disobedience would echo through generations, ultimately contributing to the downfall of his own dynasty. Now you might be wondering why this matters. Why should we care about the personal relationships of a king who lived 3,000 years ago? Here's why this story is absolutely crucial for anyone seeking to understand the Bible, biblical history, and human nature itself. David's relationships with these women reveal patterns of power, manipulation, and moral compromise that are just as relevant today as they were in ancient Israel. They show us how even the most blessed and anointed individuals can fall into traps of their own making when they allow unchecked power to corrupt their judgment. Moreover, these stories provide us with some of the most complex and nuanced female characters in all of Scripture. These weren't just passive figures in David's story. Many of them were intelligent, courageous, and resourceful women who navigated impossible circumstances with remarkable skill. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as footnotes to David's biography, but as powerful narratives in their own right. In this series, we're going to examine each of these relationships in detail, starting with the most tragic and moving on to the most scandalous. We'll explore the political motivations behind David's marriages, the cultural context that made such arrangements possible, and the devastating personal costs that these relationships extracted from everyone involved. We'll look at how these marriages affected David's children, his kingdom, and ultimately his relationship with God himself. But we're not going to stop there. We're also going to examine what modern scholarship has revealed about these relationships, including some disturbing new perspectives on stories that have been misunderstood for centuries. Recent biblical scholarship has begun to recognize power dynamics and consent issues in some of these relationships that previous generations of interpreters either missed or deliberately ignored. The implications are staggering and will force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about David's character. We'll start our journey with Michal, the daughter of King Saul, whose love story with David began with genuine passion but ended in heartbreak and political manipulation. Her story is one of the most tragic in all of Scripture, a tale of a woman who loved deeply but found herself used as a pawn in the deadly game of royal politics. You'll discover how Saul used his own daughter as bait to try to get David killed, how David later demanded her return, not out of love but for political advantage, and how her story ended in abandonment and childlessness. Then we'll explore the remarkable story of Abigail, perhaps the most intelligent and diplomatically skilled woman in the entire Old Testament. Her intervention in a crisis situation not only saved lives, but demonstrated a level of wisdom and courage that puts many modern leaders to shame. Yet even her story has darker undertones that reveal the harsh realities faced by women in the ancient world, where even the most capable and intelligent could find their fates determined by the ambitions of powerful men. But it's when we get to Bathsheba that the story becomes truly explosive. For generations, Sunday school teachers and preachers have told the story of David and Bathsheba as a tale of mutual seduction and adultery. But modern biblical scholars are increasingly recognizing what should have been obvious all along. This wasn't a consensual affair between equals. This was an abuse of power by the most powerful man in the kingdom against a woman who had no ability to refuse his advances. The implications of this realization are staggering and force us to completely reconsider one of the most famous stories in the Bible. We'll also examine the stories of David's other wives, Ahinoam, Maezich, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah, women whose names are recorded in Scripture, but whose stories have largely been forgotten. Each of these relationships tells us something different about the political and social dynamics of David's court, and together, they paint a picture of a royal household that was far more complex and troubled than most people realize. Perhaps most disturbing of all, we'll explore the fate of David's 10 concubines, women who became victims of the power struggle between David and his rebellious son Absalom. Their story reveals the horrific cost that women often paid for the political ambitions of the men around them, and it raises serious questions about justice, mercy, and the treatment of victims in ancient legal systems. Throughout this series, we'll be examining not just the historical facts, but also the theological implications of these relationships. How do we reconcile David's status as a man after God's own heart with his clear violations of divine commandments regarding marriage? What does his treatment of these women tell us about his character and his relationship with God? And how did these relationships contribute to the family dysfunction and political instability that would plague his dynasty for generations to come? We'll also explore the cultural and historical context that made such arrangements possible. In the ancient Near East, royal marriages were primarily political tools, And concepts of romantic love and individual choice that we take for granted today were largely irrelevant to the marriages of kings and queens. Understanding this context doesn't excuse David's behavior, but it does help us understand how such arrangements could exist alongside genuine religious devotion. But perhaps most importantly, we'll examine what these stories teach us about power, corruption, and human nature. David's relationships with these women show us how unchecked power can corrupt even the most blessed individuals, how political ambition can override moral considerations, and how the consequences of our choices often extend far beyond ourselves to affect innocent people around us. The story we're about to unfold together isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror that reflects timeless truths about human nature, power dynamics, and the complex relationship between public righteousness and private behavior. These are lessons that are just as relevant in our modern world of political scandals and abuse of power as they were in ancient Israel. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey through some of the most complex, controversial, and ultimately revealing stories in all of biblical literature. These aren't the sanitized Sunday school versions you might remember from childhood. These are the raw, unvarnished accounts of real people dealing with real consequences in a world where power, politics, and passion collided with devastating results. By the time we're finished, you'll never look at King David the same way again. Now let's dive into the first of these shocking relationships. And trust me, this story will shatter everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and political manipulation in the ancient world. We're talking about Michal, the daughter of King Saul, and her tragic entanglement with David that began with genuine love but ended in one of the most heartbreaking betrayals in biblical history. Picture this scene: a young woman, a princess no less, who falls deeply in love with the rising star of her father's kingdom. The Bible tells us explicitly that Michal loved David. Think about that for a moment. In a world where women's feelings were rarely considered, where marriages were arranged for political convenience, the scriptures take the time to record that this woman genuinely loved this man. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The Bible never once mentions David loving Michal in return. King Saul, Michal's father, discovered his daughter's feelings for David, and instead of protecting her heart, he saw an opportunity. This wasn't a loving father concerned about his daughter's happiness. This was a calculating politician who saw his daughter's emotions as a weapon he could use against his greatest rival. When David expressed interest in marrying Michal, Saul didn't ask for gold or land as a bride price. Instead, he demanded something far more sinister: 100 foreskins from dead Philistine soldiers. Think about the twisted psychology behind this demand. Saul was essentially saying, "If you want to marry my daughter, go get yourself killed fighting our enemies." He was using his own daughter as bait in an assassination plot. What kind of father does that? What kind of man uses his child's love as a tool for murder? But David, being David, didn't just meet Saul's impossible demand. He doubled it, bringing back 200 Philistine foreskins, proving once again that he was not a man to be underestimated. So Michal married David, and for a brief moment, it seemed like love might actually triumph in this political chess game. But that moment of happiness wouldn't last long. Saul's jealousy and paranoia continued to grow, and soon David was forced to flee for his life. And here's where Michal's story becomes truly tragic. While David was running from cave to cave, hiding in the wilderness, fighting for his very survival, Saul made a decision that would haunt his daughter for the rest of her life. Saul gave Michal, David's wife, to another man, a man named Palti, son of Laish. Can you imagine the emotional devastation? Michal had loved David enough to help him escape from her father's murderous plots. She had risked her own life to save the man she loved. And while he was gone, she was handed over to another man like a piece of property to be traded. The Bible doesn't tell us how Michal felt about this arrangement, but we can only imagine the heartbreak, the sense of abandonment, the crushing realization that her feelings meant nothing in the grand scheme of political maneuvering. But the story gets even more twisted. Years later, when David had finally become king and was consolidating his power, he demanded Michal back, not because he missed her, not because he loved her, but because she represented a political advantage. Marrying into Saul's family gave David legitimacy in the eyes of those who still supported the old dynasty. So David sent word to Ishbosheth, Saul's son who was trying to hold on to what remained of his father's kingdom, demanding the return of his wife. The scene that followed is one of the most heartbreaking in all of Scripture. The Bible tells us that Palti, the man who had been married to Michal during David's exile, followed behind as she was taken away, weeping as he walked. This wasn't just a political transaction to him. He had apparently grown to love Michal during their time together. But his feelings, like hers, meant nothing in the face of David's political ambitions. Think about this from Michal's perspective. She had been torn away from the man she loved, forced to marry another, and then torn away from him as well when it became politically convenient. She had become nothing more than a pawn in a game played by powerful men who saw her as property to be traded rather than a human being with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires. But the final tragedy of Michal's story was yet to come. When David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, he danced before the Lord with such abandon that his royal garments came loose, essentially exposing himself before the crowds. When Michal saw this display, she was disgusted. She confronted David, accusing him of making a spectacle of himself before the servant girls and common people. Now on the surface, this might seem like the scolding of a prudish wife embarrassed by her husband's public display. But look deeper. Michal had spent years watching the men in her life use religion and politics to justify their treatment of her. Her father had claimed to serve God while using her as a tool for murder. David had claimed divine right while treating her as a political asset rather than a beloved wife. Is it any wonder that she had become cynical about religious displays? David's response to Michal's criticism was swift and brutal. He essentially told her that he would continue to humble himself before God, and that the servant girl she mentioned would honor him even if she wouldn't. The implication was clear. If she couldn't appreciate his devotion to God, then she was expendable. The Bible's final note on Michal is devastating in its simplicity. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. This wasn't just a statement about biology. In the ancient world, a woman's worth was largely measured by her ability to produce heirs, especially for a king. By having no children, Michal was effectively erased from the future. Saul's dynasty, which might have continued through her, was cut off forever. She lived out her days in the royal palace, surrounded by luxury, but utterly alone. A woman who had loved deeply, but had been betrayed by every man she had ever trusted. But here's what makes Michal's story even more tragic. She represents countless women throughout history who have been caught in the crossfire of powerful men's ambitions. Her story isn't just about ancient Israel. It's about what happens when women are treated as objects rather than people, when their feelings and desires are considered irrelevant to the greater good of political expediency. Modern scholars have begun to recognize that Michal's criticism of David's dancing may not have been about prudishness at all. Some suggest that she was actually making a profound statement about the abuse of power. She had watched David use his relationship with God to justify his political actions, including his treatment of her. When she saw him dancing half-naked before the crowds, claiming it was for God's glory, she may have been calling out what she saw as hypocrisy. Think about it from her perspective. Here was a man who claimed to love God above all else, yet he had treated his own wife as a political tool. He spoke of humbling himself before the Lord, yet he had shown no humility in his treatment of the women in his life. Michal's confrontation with David may have been less about his dancing and more about the contradiction between his public piety and his private cruelty. The punishment that followed, her childlessness and isolation, reveals something disturbing about David's character. This was a man who could write beautiful psalms about God's love and mercy, yet he could condemn his own wife to a life of loneliness and irrelevance because she dared to question his behavior. The contrast between David's public righteousness and his private ruthlessness is stark and troubling. Michal's story also reveals the devastating cost of political marriages in the ancient world. She wasn't just David's wife. She was a symbol of his legitimacy, a living reminder of his connection to the previous dynasty. But symbols aren't people, and the human cost of treating her as such was enormous. Her love was exploited, her loyalty was betrayed, and her life was ultimately sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. What makes this story even more relevant today is how it reflects ongoing patterns of power abuse. Throughout history, powerful men have used women as tools to advance their own agendas, often while claiming to serve higher purposes. Michal's story reminds us that behind every political transaction involving marriage, alliance, or family connection, there are real people with real feelings who pay real costs for the ambitions of others. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Michal's story is how it's been interpreted over the centuries. Many traditional commentaries paint her as the villain, the nagging wife who didn't appreciate her husband's spiritual devotion. They focus on her criticism of David's dancing, while ignoring the years of manipulation and betrayal that led to that moment. This interpretation reveals how power structures can shape even our understanding of Scripture, making the victims appear to be the villains while protecting the powerful from scrutiny. When we read Michal's story with fresh eyes, we see not a petty, jealous woman, but a victim of systematic abuse who finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Her confrontation with David wasn't about dancing, it was about dignity. It wasn't about religion, it was about respect. And the fact that she was punished so severely for daring to speak up reveals more about David's character than it does about hers. The tragedy of Michal's fate becomes even more profound when we consider what happened to her during Absalom's rebellion. Remember, she had already endured decades of being treated as a political pawn, watching helplessly as the men in her life made decisions about her future without any regard for her feelings or desires. But the worst was yet to come, and it would involve not just David's treatment of her, but his complete abandonment of the women who had served in his household. When Absalom launched his coup against his father, David was forced to flee Jerusalem in one of the most humiliating moments of his reign. Picture the scene: the great king, the man after God's own heart, running for his life from his own son. But here's what's truly shocking about David's escape. As he fled the palace, he made a calculated decision that reveals the depths of his callousness toward the women in his life. David took most of his household with him in his flight, but he deliberately left behind 10 of his concubines to keep the house. Think about that decision for a moment. These women had served David faithfully, had borne his children, had been part of his household for years. Yet when danger came, when his own safety was at stake, he abandoned them without a second thought. He left them behind like furniture, like objects that could be replaced if necessary. But David's abandonment of these women wasn't just cruel, it was strategically devastating for them personally. David knew exactly what he was doing when he left those concubines behind. In the political chess game he was playing with Absalom, those women weren't just servants he was leaving to tend the palace. They were sacrificial pawns in a game of royal legitimacy that would destroy their lives forever. You see, in the ancient world, taking possession of a king's wives and concubines was one of the most powerful symbols of political conquest. It wasn't just about claiming the palace or the treasury. It was about demonstrating that you had completely replaced the previous ruler, that you had taken not just his throne, but his most intimate possessions. David knew this. Every ancient ruler knew this. And yet he left those women behind anyway. What happened next was exactly what David should have expected, and probably did expect. Absalom, following the advice of Ahithophel, publicly violated David's concubines on the roof of the palace in full view of all Israel. This wasn't just a personal assault on these women. It was a political statement, a declaration that Absalom had completely supplanted his father's authority. But the women who suffered through this public humiliation were innocent victims of a power struggle they had no part in creating. Can you imagine the terror these women must have felt? They had been abandoned by the man they had served faithfully, left defenseless in a palace that was about to be overrun by his enemies. They knew what was coming. They understood the political implications of their situation. Yet they had no power to escape, no ability to protect themselves, no choice but to endure whatever fate awaited them. The violation these women suffered wasn't just physical. It was a complete destruction of their social standing, their identity, their future prospects. In a culture where a woman's honor was everything, where sexual purity determined their value and their place in society, what happened to them on that rooftop was a kind of social death. They were no longer David's concubines, but they could never be anyone else's wives either. They had been rendered untouchable, unmarriageable, socially dead. But here's where David's character is revealed in all its ugly complexity. When he returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's defeat, what did he do with these women who had suffered so terribly because of his abandonment? Did he show them compassion? Did he acknowledge that their suffering was a direct result of his decision to leave them behind? Did he take responsibility for what had happened to them? No. David's solution was to lock them away for the rest of their lives. The Bible tells us that he put them in a house under guard, provided for their basic needs, but never went into them again. They lived, the scripture says, as if they were widows, shut up until the day of their death. Think about that. These women, who had already been violated and humiliated through no fault of their own, were then sentenced to a lifetime of isolation and loneliness. From David's perspective, this arrangement probably seemed merciful. He could have divorced them and sent them away with nothing, leaving them to face a hostile world as damaged goods that no respectable man would marry. He could have had them executed for being defiled, which some ancient legal codes might have permitted. Instead, he chose what he probably saw as a compassionate middle ground. He would support them financially but keep them isolated to avoid any questions about his own honor. But look at this arrangement from the women's perspective. They had been abandoned, assaulted, and now imprisoned for life because of circumstances completely beyond their control. They were being punished for being victims. Their isolation wasn't mercy. It was a continuation of their suffering, a daily reminder that they had been deemed unworthy of normal human relationships because of what had been done to them. This is where the story becomes not just tragic, but truly disturbing from a moral standpoint. David, the man who wrote psalm after psalm about God's justice and mercy, showed neither justice nor mercy to these women. He treated them as collateral damage in his political struggles, and when they suffered the consequences of his decisions, he responded by making them disappear from his life entirely. What makes this even more troubling is that David had options. He could have acknowledged that these women were innocent victims and found ways to restore their honor and dignity. He could have used his royal authority to declare them blameless and arrange honorable marriages for them with men who would accept his royal endorsement. He could have given them positions of respect in his court that didn't depend on their sexual status. Instead, he chose the option that was most convenient for him personally, regardless of what it meant for them. The fate of these 10 concubines reveals something profoundly disturbing about how women were viewed and treated in David's court. They weren't people with inherent dignity and worth. They were possessions that could be abandoned when inconvenient, violated when politically useful to enemies, and discarded when they became socially problematic. Their suffering mattered less than David's reputation, their futures less than his comfort. But the story of these concubines also connects to a larger pattern in David's treatment of women throughout his life. Whether we're talking about Michal, who was used as a political pawn and then abandoned when she became inconvenient, or Bathsheba, whose consent was never considered relevant to David's desires, or these nameless concubines who were sacrificed for political expediency, the pattern is consistent. David repeatedly prioritized his own needs, desires, and political advantages over the welfare of the women in his life. This pattern becomes even more disturbing when we consider that David was supposed to be the model king for Israel, the standard by which all future rulers would be measured. The way he treated women wasn't just a personal failing. It was setting a precedent for how power could be exercised in Israel. His son Solomon would take these patterns to even greater extremes, accumulating hundreds of wives and concubines in arrangements that were even more obviously exploitative. What's particularly striking about the concubine story is how it's been largely ignored in traditional biblical teaching. Most sermons about Absalom's rebellion focus on the political and military aspects of the conflict, or on the emotional drama between father and son. The suffering of these women is mentioned briefly, if at all, and when it is discussed, it's usually presented as just one more tragic consequence of Absalom's rebellion, rather than as a direct result of David's own choices. This selective focus reveals something important about how we read Scripture and whose stories we consider worth telling. The dramatic political and military events that affected powerful men are remembered and analyzed in detail. The personal tragedies that befell powerless women are footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. Yet these women's stories are just as much a part of the biblical narrative as the battles and the politics, and they reveal just as much about the character of the people involved. The isolation of David's concubines also raises profound questions about justice and mercy in the biblical narrative. These women had committed no crime, yet they were sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment. They had been victims of assault, yet they were treated as if they were the ones who had done something wrong. Where was God's justice for them? Where was the divine intervention that David experienced so often in his own crises? Some might argue that David's provision for these women, even in isolation, was better than the alternatives available in that culture. And there's some truth to that argument. In a world where women had few rights and fewer options, financial security was not something to dismiss lightly. But this argument misses the deeper point. David had the power to create better alternatives. As king, he could have changed the cultural norms that made these women's situation so impossible. He could have used his authority to challenge the assumptions that made them unmarriageable after being assaulted. Instead, David chose to work within the existing system in the way that was most convenient for him, even when that system was manifestly unjust to its victims. This reveals something troubling about his understanding of his role as king, and his responsibility to use his power for justice rather than just for his own benefit. The story of these concubines also illuminates the broader issue of how sexual violence was understood and addressed in the ancient world. The women were considered defiled by what had happened to them, even though they had no choice in the matter. The shame and social consequences fell on them rather than on their attackers. This wasn't unique to Israel. It was a common pattern throughout the ancient Near East. But David, as God's anointed king, might have been expected to challenge these unjust assumptions rather than simply accepting them. What's perhaps most tragic about these women's fate is how completely they disappear from the biblical narrative after their imprisonment. We don't know their names, we don't know their backgrounds, we don't know what they thought or felt about their situation. They become invisible, erased from history except for this brief mention of their suffering. Their individual humanity is lost in the political machinations of the men around them. This erasure reflects a broader pattern in how women's stories are told, or not told, in Scripture and in history generally. The women who suffer the consequences of powerful men's decisions often disappear from the record, while the men whose choices created their suffering are remembered as heroes, or at least as complex figures worthy of detailed analysis. The concubine story reminds us that there are always human costs to political decisions, and those costs are often borne by people who have no voice in the historical record. As we continue to examine David's relationships with women, the pattern that emerges is deeply troubling. Whether through political calculation, personal desire, or simple indifference, David repeatedly made choices that caused tremendous suffering to the women in his life. And in most cases, that suffering was then compounded by social systems that blamed the victims rather than holding the powerful accountable for their actions. Yet perhaps the most shocking revelation about David's relationships comes when we examine the broader theological implications of his marital practices. Here was a man who had been explicitly warned by God's own law not to multiply wives, yet he systematically violated this commandment throughout his reign. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17 clearly states that a king should not multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away from God. But David ignored this divine warning, and the consequences would reverberate through generations. The tragic irony is that David's violation of God's marriage laws contributed directly to the very family dysfunction that would plague his dynasty. His multiple marriages created a household filled with jealousy, rivalry, and resentment among his children. When you have multiple wives competing for status and trying to advance their own children's interests, conflict is inevitable. The murder of Amnon by Absalom, the rebellion of Absalom against his father, the coup attempt by Adonijah, all of these catastrophic events can be traced back to the poisonous family dynamics created by David's polygamous arrangements. Think about this for a moment. David's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, daughter of David's wife Machesach. When David failed to punish Amnon adequately, Tamar's full brother Absalom took matters into his own hands, murdering Amnon and then launching a rebellion that nearly destroyed the kingdom. This wasn't just family drama. This was the direct result of a household structure that pitted David's children against each other from birth. The pattern continued into the next generation with even more devastating results. David's son Solomon, who inherited both the throne and his father's example, took the practice of political marriages to shocking extremes. The Bible tells us that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, a harem so vast that it became a symbol of excess and corruption. These marriages, ostensibly made for political alliance, ultimately led Solomon's heart away from God, exactly as the law had warned they would. But here's what's truly staggering about this generational pattern. The dynasty that God had promised would last forever, the royal line through which the Messiah would eventually come, was weakened from within by the very practices that were supposed to strengthen it politically. David's multiple marriages, intended to create alliances and consolidate power, actually destabilized his kingdom and set the stage for its eventual division under his grandson Rehoboam. The human cost of these political calculations was enormous. Beyond the named wives we've discussed, David had numerous other wives and concubines whose stories have been lost to history. Each of these women represents a life disrupted, a family torn apart, a person reduced to a political asset rather than treated as a human being with inherent dignity and worth. The multiplication of these relationships didn't just violate God's law, it multiplied human suffering on a massive scale. What makes David's story even more complex is how it reveals the dangerous intersection of personal desire and political power. David's relationship with Bathsheba, which we've touched on, represents perhaps the most extreme example of how unchecked royal authority could destroy innocent lives. Modern scholarship has increasingly recognized that what happened between David and Bathsheba wasn't a consensual affair between equals. It was an abuse of power by the most powerful man in the kingdom against a woman who had no ability to refuse his advances. The cover-up that followed, including the murder of Bathsheba's husband Uriah, shows how far David was willing to go to protect his reputation and avoid the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just adultery. It was a systematic abuse of royal power that resulted in multiple deaths and immeasurable suffering. Yet for centuries, this story has been told as if both parties were equally culpable, ignoring the fundamental power imbalance that made true consent impossible. The divine judgment that followed David's sin with Bathsheba provides crucial insight into how God viewed these violations of his law. Through the prophet Nathan, God declared that the sword would never depart from David's house, that his own family would rebel against him, and that what he had done in secret would be done to him publicly. The fulfillment of this prophecy through the rebellion of Absalom and the violation of David's concubines shows that there are always consequences for the abuse of power, even when those consequences are delayed. But perhaps the most sobering aspect of David's story is how it reflects patterns that continue to this day. Throughout history, powerful men have used their positions to exploit those with less power, often while claiming to serve higher purposes. They've justified their actions through political necessity, religious devotion, or cultural norms, but the underlying pattern remains the same. The powerful take what they want from the powerless, and the powerless bear the consequences. David's relationships with women also reveal how systems of power can corrupt even those who begin with good intentions. David started as a shepherd boy, the youngest son of a modest family, who was chosen by God for his heart rather than his position. But as his power grew, so did his sense of entitlement. The man who once refused to harm King Saul because he was God's anointed became someone who thought nothing of taking another man's wife and arranging that man's murder to cover his tracks. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of moral compromise that began with small violations and escalated over time. Each successful abuse of power made the next one easier to justify. Each woman who was treated as a political asset rather than a person made it easier to view all women in his household as objects rather than individuals. The corruption of power is often incremental, and David's story shows us how even the most blessed individuals can fall when they lose sight of their accountability to God and to those they're called to protect. The legacy of David's marital practices extended far beyond his own lifetime. The example he set influenced not just his immediate successors, but the entire understanding of royal prerogative in ancient Israel. Future kings looked to David as their model, and many of them interpreted his example as permission to pursue their own desires without regard for divine law or human dignity. The pattern of exploitation that David established became normalized, institutionalized, and passed down through generations. Yet even in the midst of this dark picture, there are glimmers of hope and redemption. The Bible doesn't hide David's failures or present him as a perfect hero. Instead, it records his sins alongside his victories, his moral failures alongside his spiritual insights. This honest portrayal serves as both a warning and an invitation. A warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power, and an invitation to learn from David's mistakes rather than repeat them. The women in David's story, despite being marginalized and exploited, often displayed remarkable courage, wisdom, and resilience. Abigail's diplomatic intervention saved lives and demonstrated extraordinary leadership skills. Michal's final confrontation with David, whatever its motivations, showed that even the most powerless could speak truth to power. Even Bathsheba, in her limited appearances in the narrative, shows signs of intelligence and strength that suggest there was much more to her story than we've been told. These women's stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of the human cost of political ambition and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. They challenge us to look beyond the official narratives of power and success to see the real people whose lives were affected by the decisions of their leaders. They call us to recognize that behind every political alliance, every strategic marriage, every exercise of royal prerogative, there are human beings whose stories deserve to be heard and whose suffering deserves to be acknowledged. As we reach the end of this shocking journey through the hidden relationships of King David, we're left with profound questions that echo across the centuries. How do we reconcile David's status as a man after God's own heart with his clear violations of divine law and basic human decency? What does his treatment of women tell us about the nature of power and its tendency to corrupt even the most blessed individuals? And how can we learn from these ancient stories to build more just and compassionate societies today? The answers to these questions aren't simple, and they shouldn't be. David's story is complex precisely because human nature is complex. We're capable of both great good and great evil, often simultaneously. We can write beautiful psalms about God's love while treating those around us with cruelty and indifference. We can be genuinely devoted to spiritual truth while living in ways that contradict our deepest beliefs. But perhaps that's exactly why these stories were preserved for us. They remind us that we're all capable of falling, that none of us is immune to the corrupting influence of power and privilege. They call us to examine our own lives and relationships, to ask ourselves whether we're treating others with the dignity and respect they deserve, or whether we're using them for our own purposes while justifying our actions through higher principles. The hidden wives of King David weren't just footnotes in ancient history. They were real women with real hopes, fears, and dreams who found themselves caught in the web of one man's ambition. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, and their humanity deserves to be honored. In remembering them, we honor not just their memory, but the principle that every person, regardless of their power or status, has inherent worth and dignity that must be respected. As you reflect on what we've uncovered together today, I challenge you to think beyond the surface narratives you've been taught. Look deeper into the stories you think you know. Ask hard questions about power, privilege, and the treatment of the vulnerable. And most importantly, consider how these ancient lessons apply to your own life and the world around you. The shocking secrets of David's relationships aren't just about one king from thousands of years ago. They're about patterns of human behavior that continue to this day, about the responsibility that comes with power, and about the importance of treating every person with the dignity they deserve as bearers of God's image. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey through some of the most complex and challenging stories in biblical history. If this video has opened your eyes to new perspectives on familiar stories, please share it with others who might benefit from these insights. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we'll be continuing to explore the hidden truths and shocking secrets that lie beneath the surface of biblical narratives. Until next time, may you have the courage to face difficult truths, the wisdom to learn from the mistakes of the past, and the compassion to treat every person you encounter with the dignity and respect they deserve as fellow human beings, created in the image of God.